In the decades following Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn, roughly 70 men claimed to have escaped his battalion's extermination and been Custer's sole survivor. Most of the stories these guys tell are so far-fetched they don't deserve further examination. But the fact remains that only about a quarter of the hacked up and decomposing bodies surrounding Custer were ever identified. It's a fascinating idea that at least one of the 200-plus troopers that rode with Custer survived the battle. Now, the only confirmed Army survivor that made it home from the battlefield was Comanche, the horse Captain Miles Keogh rode into the battle. After the battle, Comanche was found with half a dozen wounds and left to die, but he followed the slow-moving Army column back up the Bighorn River and was nursed back to health. Comanche became the 7th Cavalry's mascot, and it was ordered that he would never be saddled, ridden, or have to work a day in his life again. Today, he's stuffed at the University of Kansas because, why not? So if Comanche survived the fight, is it plausible one of Custer's troopers did too? The first source we can go to for information are the known surviving eyewitnesses of the event, namely the native warriors who fought and killed Custer's men. The warriors' accounts all agree on a couple of important details. First, nobody took any prisoners or left anyone alive on the battlefield. As Gall, one of the Hunkpapa war chiefs, later said, "No, we took no prisoners. Our hearts were bad and we cut and shot them all to pieces." Intriguingly though, many warrior narratives mention a soldier, usually described as an officer, fleeing the final moments of the fight on a fast, powerful horse while being pursued by several warriors. According to Turtle Rib, a Miniconjou warrior who claimed to be the third warrior chasing the soldier rode like the wind and appeared to be getting away from them when he killed himself. Turtle Rib was unable to recall what direction the soldier had ridden off, but Spotted Horn Bull said he had seen a soldier ride eastward for miles before shooting himself, and even prepared a rudimentary map indicating as such. There's no way of knowing if they're both talking about the same soldier. When Major Reno's soldiers finally visited the Custer sector of the battlefield, they also noted isolated soldiers found at a distance from the main bodies. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, who commanded Company K, wrote, "One of the first bodies I recognized and one of the nearest to the ford was that of Sergeant Butler of Tom Custer's troop. Sergeant Butler was a soldier of many years' experience and of known courage. The indications were that he had sold his life dearly, for near and under him were found many empty cartridge shells. From knowledge of his personality and his detached position, I believe he had been selected as courier to communicate with Reno." Other troopers moving north from Reno's camp noted Sergeant Butler's body hundreds of yards south of the other bodies. Years after the battle, a marker was erected south of the battlefield boundary line for Sergeant Butler. So did Sergeant Butler survive Custer's defeat, at least for a little while? Well, Sergeant Butler's body was found along the route theorized to have been used by Custer after he attempted to cross the nearby ford into the village. As Custer moved north, warriors trailed him and fired into his troopers. Anybody who has stood in a military formation knows that while the commander leads from the front, the first sergeant follows the formation in the rear. It's possible that Sergeant Butler took a round during this portion of the fight and made his own one-man stand. It's also possible Sergeant Butler was able to flee the immediate slaughter of his company until he was brought down a few hundred yards away. There are a few problems with Lieutenant Godfrey's description of Sergeant Butler. Godfrey describes Butler as belonging to Tom Custer's company, which was Company C. But Sergeant Butler wasn't in Company C. He was the first sergeant of Company L. Godfrey also believes Sergeant Butler had been sent as a courier, a messenger, to communicate with either Reno or Benteen. But according to John Martin, the man who delivered Custer's last written order and was spared the killing, First Sergeant Butler was not on orderly duty that day. It's also weird to use such a high-ranking NCO for such a minor role. If the senior enlisted soldier of a company who is not on orderly duty that day is being used as a messenger, it's bad. First Sergeant Butler's body was not the only one seen south of the rest of Custer's soldiers. In fact, it wasn't even the first. Stanislaus Roy, at the time a corporal with Company A, told how on June 28th his outfit moved north from Reno's camp towards Custer's fallen troopers. The first dead body we came to was that of Corporal John Foley. I heard several say, "There lies Foley of C Company." I saw him and recognized him easily, as he had bald head and black hair. He was of middle age, and I knew him well. Foley was at least 3/4 mile in advance of the first group of dead at C. The next body we came to was that of Sergeant Butler, and from him to the first group of dead at C, the distance was considerable. He lay probably one halfway from Foley to C. There was no dead horse near either Foley or Butler. Foley might have been given a message to take to Reno or Benteen, but the native accounts suggest otherwise. At the 10th anniversary of the battle, Gall, who led the fighting in the area, indicated to Army officers that Foley was the soldier seen by Turtle Rib and others as the one who had shot himself. Gall even mentioned the soldier having chevrons on his sleeve. For the most part, 4 of the 5 companies that fought under Custer died in relatively easy-to-identify clusters. But Company C is a little bit of an anomaly. Its commander, Captain Tom Custer, was found on Last Stand Hill near his brother. But apparently Tom was serving as an aide to George that day, and so Second Lieutenant Henry Harrington had actual command of the company. 2 Company C sergeants were found on the southern end of the battlefield. The company's first sergeant, Edwin Bobo, was found near Captain Keogh, and Company C privates were positively identified on Last Stand Hill. Lieutenant Harrington's body was never identified. There's a lot of confusion over Company C's final disposition, and decades after the fact, a farmer's story would only add to the confusion. In 1921, Frank Finkle, a 67-year-old retired farmer, gave an interview to the Walla Walla Bulletin, claiming to have ridden with Custer's battalion into Custer's last stand and escaping with his life. In his first published narrative about his claim, Finkle claimed to have enlisted on a dare under the name Frank Hall. At the Little Bighorn, Finkle claimed he was shot in the foot and above his hip, with another round splintering his rifle. Finkle's horse galloped through the enemy lines, with Finkle in varying levels of consciousness. After 3 days, Finkle came across 2 men in a cabin, recovered from his wounds, and in November set out for Fort Benton, 2 days north of the cabin. He said he never received discharge papers because there was nobody left in his command to apply to. As far as the Army was concerned, Frank Hall was reported dead, along with the rest of Custer's men, and I let it go at that. In this video's description, I'll post a link to Finkle's interview with the Walla Walla Bulletin. Feel free to read it yourself. There are some researchers who believe Finkle's claim. They note Finkle's familiarity with the streams in the area, the presence of a dead cavalry horse at the mouth of the Rosebud Creek after the battle, and his name's similarity to August Finkle, one of Company C's sergeants. Books have been written about whether or not Sergeant Finkle and Frank Finkle were the same person, and about whether Sergeant Finkle's body was actually identified on Finley Finkle Ridge. If you want me to get more in the weeds on this, then leave a comment and let me know, but for now I'll just say that Finkle, in his first statement on the matter, never claimed to be August Finkle. He stated multiple times he enlisted under the name Frank Hall. Sergeant Finkle joined the 7th Cav in 1872, 2 years before Frank Finkle claimed to join the Army, and multiple people attested to finding Sergeant Finkle's body on the ridge named after him. There are also no records of a Frank Hall being present at the Little Bighorn. I've read a lot of soldier accounts of the battle, and they often give specific details that could be corroborated by other accounts. In contrast, there are no details in Finkle's first account that you couldn't have gotten from a newspaper article on the fight. It's also unusual how Finkle just decided to cut loose from the Army. His claim that there was nobody left of his command to apply to is just wrong. The Army chain of command outlasts anybody's death. While all his company officers were killed, after the battle, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Varnum was transferred from Company A to Company C until a new captain could be found for the company. And even then, it wasn't like every member of Company C had died in the battle. In fact, Company C had more than 20 men who survived. The morning of the battle, Custer had sent details from each company to assist the pack train, plus some men's horses had become so tired they could not keep up with the rest of the regiment. Someone who had been there at the fight would have known all this. Had Finkle reported back to his unit, like a soldier's required to do, he probably would not have been punished like a deserter. Finkle's survival would have been cheered by the men as a small victory in a large defeat. I mean, look at how they celebrated the survival of a horse. Whatever you think of Finkle's story, there is one element of it that requires a little further investigation: the presence of a dead cavalry horse on Rosebud Creek after the battle. Remember how I mentioned how authentic soldier accounts often corroborate other accounts? Well, in an article written in 1892, Lieutenant Godfrey wrote, "The question has often been asked if any soldier escaped. In August, we camped at the mouth of the Rosebud, where we found the carcass of a horse shot in the head. Near the horse was a carbine. On the saddle was a small grain sack made of canvas and used by the 7th Cavalry only to carry oats during the march, when detached from the wagons." Other soldiers claimed to have seen the horse, along with its rider, just a few miles south of the Yellowstone River and more than 60 miles away from the Little Bighorn. Private Ferdinand Widmeyer of Company M noted the soldier had been dead for a long time and his clothing had rotted. George Glenn, a private in Company H, remembered a white wool hat being found near the Rosebud with brass cross sabers and a small letter C. Sergeant Daniel Knipe, who was in Company C, recognized the hat as belonging to 22-year-old Nathan Short. Private Short had last been seen with the rest of his company, riding behind Custer. Short's roster number was allegedly found on some of the equipment there, giving more credence to the idea he had escaped the immediate destruction around him, only to die alone along Rosebud Creek. Today, along State Highway 447, a few miles south of Interstate 94, near where Rosebud Creek empties into the Yellowstone River, a small stone memorial marks where the trooper was found and buried. So now it's your turn. What do you think happened to Sergeant Butler, Corporal Foley, and Nate Short? Do you believe Frank Finkle's story? And are there any other survivor stories you think are credible? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more videos like this one, and click the notification bell so you're the first to know when another video on the Story Out West drops. Thanks for watching.